On a cold December afternoon in 1972, 7-year-old Steven Stayner left school in Merced, California, expecting to walk the familiar route home. It was a path he had taken countless times before. Nothing about that day suggested history was about to change. Children laughed as they left school. Cars passed along the quiet streets. Parents expected their sons and daughters home before dinner. But Steven never arrived. For the Stayner family, the hours that followed became a nightmare. At first, there was hope. Perhaps he had stopped to play. Perhaps he had visited a friend without telling anyone. But as daylight faded, hope slowly turned into panic. Family members searched the neighborhood. Friends joined the effort. Police were notified. By nightfall, officers were searching for a missing 7-year-old boy. No one knew that Steven had already been taken miles away by a man who introduced himself as someone he could trust. According to investigators, Steven was approached by Kenneth Parnell, a convicted sex offender who falsely claimed to be associated with a church and persuaded Steven to get into his vehicle. Authorities later determined that Steven had been abducted in broad daylight. Within hours, the search expanded across Merced County. Missing person bulletins were distributed. Police questioned neighbors. Roadblocks were considered. Volunteers searched fields, canals, and nearby communities. Yet every hour that passed made the investigation more difficult. There was no surveillance footage, no mobile phone records, no GPS, no Amber Alert system existed in 1972. Investigators relied almost entirely on witness interviews and physical searches. Despite enormous public attention, the trail quickly grew cold. For Steven's parents, Delbert and Kay Stayner, every passing day became another painful reminder that their son had vanished without explanation. Christmas arrived only weeks after the kidnapping. His presents remained unopened. His bedroom stayed exactly as he had left it. His family refused to give up hope. Across California, Steven's photograph appeared on missing child posters and milk cartons in later years. His disappearance became one of the state's most recognized missing child cases. But while investigators searched, Steven was already living under a false identity. According to court records, Kenneth Parnell renamed him Dennis Gregory Parnell, telling others that Steven was his son. The new identity became part of Parnell's effort to avoid suspicion. Steven was only 7 years old, separated from his family, dependent on the very man who had taken him. Experts have long explained that children in these circumstances often experience fear, confusion, and psychological manipulation. Their behavior cannot be judged by the expectations placed on adults. Over time, Steven attended school under his assumed identity. He interacted with neighbors. People who met him often had no reason to suspect he had been kidnapped years earlier. To the outside world, he appeared to be living with his father, but behind that appearance was a child separated from everyone who loved him. Back in Merced, the investigation continued. Detectives followed countless leads. Possible sightings were reported across several states. Each report raised hope. Most ended in disappointment. Years passed. Birthdays came and went. Steven's family never stopped believing he could still be alive. The case remained open. Investigators periodically reviewed new information as it became available. But without solid evidence, there was little to pursue. By the late 1970s, Steven had spent nearly his entire childhood away from home. Most missing child cases end within hours or days. Steven's captivity would last more than 7 years. Then, everything changed. Not because police found Steven, not because investigators uncovered a breakthrough, but because Steven himself made a decision that would eventually save another child's life. That decision would transform him from a kidnapping victim into a hero. As the years passed, Steven Stayner's old life slowly faded from the people around him. But it never completely disappeared from his own memory. According to later interviews and court testimony, Steven remembered his real name. He remembered his parents. He remembered Merced. He remembered that somewhere, a family was still searching for him. Yet escaping was far more complicated than it might seem. Steven had been abducted at only 7 years old. Kenneth Parnell exercised control through manipulation, intimidation, and isolation. Over time, Steven was introduced to others as Dennis Gregory Parnell, supposedly Kenneth's son. Neighbors, teachers, and acquaintances had little reason to question the story. To them, it appeared to be an ordinary father and son. In reality, it was anything but ordinary. As Steven grew older, he became increasingly aware that his situation was wrong, but he also understood the risks. He had spent years under the control of the man who kidnapped him. Children who endure long-term captivity often face immense psychological pressure. Fear, dependency, and manipulation can make leaving extraordinarily difficult. Experts emphasize that these reactions are common among child victims and should never be mistaken for willingness. Meanwhile, back in Merced, Steven's parents refused to stop looking. Every reported sighting brought renewed hope. Every false lead ended in heartbreak. Birthdays passed. School years ended. Friends grew into teenagers. Steven remained missing. Law enforcement periodically reviewed the case, but without new evidence, there was little investigators could pursue. Then, in early 1980, something happened that Kenneth Parnell believed would secure his control once again. Instead, it became the beginning of the end. Parnell targeted another child. 5-year-old Timmy White disappeared from Ukiah, California, after being abducted by Parnell and an accomplice. Timmy was frightened and confused, just as Steven had been years earlier. When Steven saw the young boy, he recognized himself. 7 years earlier, he had been the child sitting beside a stranger. Now another little boy faced the same terrifying future. Steven was now 14 years old. He understood exactly what Timmy had lost: his family, his home, his childhood. For days, Steven watched the situation unfold. He knew remaining silent would likely condemn Timmy to the same years of captivity he had endured. But helping the child carried enormous risk. If Kenneth Parnell discovered Steven's intentions, the consequences were impossible to predict. Still, Steven reached a decision. He would not allow another child to lose everything he had lost. On March 1, 1980, Steven quietly left with Timmy White, while Kenneth Parnell was away. Rather than disappear on their own, Steven chose something far more courageous. He took Timmy directly to law enforcement. The pair walked into the Ukiah Police Department. There, Steven calmly identified himself. He explained that his real name was Steven Stayner. He told officers he had been kidnapped years earlier, and he told them the little boy with him had also been abducted. At first, the story seemed almost unbelievable. Police began checking missing person records. The details matched. The 7-year-old boy who had disappeared from Merced in 1972 had just walked into a police station nearly 8 years later, alive. News spread rapidly across California. Investigators contacted Steven's family. The Stayners had waited nearly 8 years for this phone call. Now it was finally happening. Their son had been found. Not because detectives located him. Not because of a lucky break, but because Steven had chosen to save another child instead of protecting only himself. His extraordinary decision rescued Timmy White and ended Kenneth Parnell's years of deception. For many Americans, Steven instantly became a symbol of courage. But as the celebrations began, a much more complicated journey was only just beginning, because coming home after 7 years is not the same as picking up where life left off. On March 1, 1980, after nearly 8 years in captivity, Steven Stayner finally returned home. For the Stayner family, it was the moment they had dreamed about since December 1972. Telephone calls spread through the community. Friends rushed to the family's home. Television crews gathered outside. Newspapers across California carried the remarkable story. The missing 7-year-old boy had come home. When Steven reunited with his parents, the emotion was overwhelming. For years, Delbert and Kay Stayner had refused to give up hope. Now, standing before them, was the son they feared they might never see again. But beneath the joy, there was another reality. Steven was no longer the 7-year-old child who had disappeared. He was 14. Nearly 8 years of his childhood had been spent under the control of the man who kidnapped him. Returning home did not erase those experiences. Instead, Steven faced a challenge many people struggled to understand. He had to rebuild a life that had continued without him. His siblings had grown older. Friends had moved on. His hometown had changed. Even ordinary routines now felt unfamiliar. Experts who work with child abduction survivors often explain that recovery is a long process. Being rescued marks the end of captivity. It does not immediately heal the emotional impact of years spent in isolation and manipulation. Steven suddenly found himself at the center of intense public attention. Television interviews, newspaper photographs, national headlines. People across America celebrated him as a hero, especially after learning he had helped rescue 5-year-old Timmy White. His courage inspired millions. Yet public recognition can also create pressure. Steven was expected to answer difficult questions about years of trauma while still adjusting to everyday life. Those close to him later described him as quiet, humble, and uncomfortable with fame. He rarely portrayed himself as a hero. Instead, he often redirected attention toward Timmy White, believing that saving another child had simply been the right thing to do. Meanwhile, investigators continued building their criminal case against Kenneth Parnell. Evidence gathered from Steven, Timmy, and numerous witnesses formed the foundation of the prosecution. Authorities charged Parnell with kidnapping Steven Stayner and Timothy White. The case attracted national media attention. For many Americans, it exposed how vulnerable children could be to manipulation by trusted adults. During the trial, Steven testified about the years he spent under Parnell's control. It was an extraordinarily difficult task. Victims are often required to revisit painful experiences in open court. Steven answered questions calmly and truthfully, helping jurors understand what had happened. In 1980, Kenneth Parnell was convicted in connection with the kidnappings. However, the sentence shocked many observers. Under California law at the time, Parnell received a sentence that many believed was far too lenient given the seriousness of the crimes. The outcome prompted widespread public criticism and renewed discussion about laws protecting children from abduction and exploitation. Although the legal proceedings ended, Steven's personal journey was far from over. He tried to build a normal life. He returned to school. He developed friendships. He worked toward creating a future beyond the headlines. Eventually, Steven married Jody Mathias. Together, they had 2 children. For a time, it appeared that life was finally giving him the peace he had been denied as a child. But tragedy would once again touch the Stayner family. On September 16, 1989, Steven was riding his motorcycle near Merced, California, when he was involved in a traffic collision. He suffered severe injuries. Despite medical treatment, Steven Stayner died at just 24 years old. The news devastated those who had followed his remarkable story. A boy who had survived nearly 8 years in captivity, who had rescued another child, who had inspired millions, was gone far too soon. His funeral drew family, friends, and members of the community who had never forgotten his extraordinary courage. Today, Steven Stayner is remembered not only as a kidnapping survivor, but as a young man whose selfless decision changed another child's life forever. If he had escaped alone, Timmy White might have remained in captivity. Instead, Steven refused to leave another frightened little boy behind. That single act became one of the most remarkable moments in the history of child abduction cases in the United States. Yet Steven's story would have another unexpected chapter. Years after his death, his family's name would once again make national headlines. But this time, for a reason no one could have imagined. If Steven's courage has moved you so far, consider taking a moment to like this video. It helps more people discover stories of extraordinary bravery and ensures victims like Steven are never forgotten. Steven Stayner's life ended on September 16, 1989, in a motorcycle accident near his hometown of Merced, California. He was only 24 years old. For many Americans who had followed his story since 1980, the news was heartbreaking. Steven had survived nearly 8 years of captivity. He had found the courage to rescue another child. He had reunited with his family and begun building a life of his own. His death came just as many believed his future was finally unfolding. For his family, it was another unimaginable loss. Years earlier, they had mourned the disappearance of a 7-year-old son. Then they celebrated his miraculous return. Now, they were forced to say goodbye once again. Those who knew Steven often described him as humble. Despite national recognition, he rarely portrayed himself as extraordinary. He understood that people viewed him as a hero. Yet he often insisted he had simply done what anyone should do when another child needed help. That quiet humility became part of his lasting legacy. His rescue of Timothy White also left a permanent mark on the White family. Timmy was able to return home because Steven refused to leave him behind. Instead of escaping alone, he chose compassion over safety. It remains one of the most selfless decisions ever documented in an American child abduction case. Steven's actions have since been referenced by law enforcement agencies, child protection organizations, and victim advocates as an example of extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. The criminal case against Kenneth Parnell also led to broader discussions about child protection. Many believed California's sentencing laws at the time failed to reflect the seriousness of long-term child abductions. Public reaction to Parnell's relatively short sentence prompted renewed conversations about strengthening penalties for crimes against children. Over time, laws surrounding child exploitation and kidnapping continued to evolve across the United States. Although Steven's case was not the sole reason for those changes, it became one of the cases frequently cited in discussions about improving protections for children. His story also influenced public awareness. Parents became more familiar with conversations about stranger danger, although modern child safety experts now emphasize a broader approach that includes recognizing manipulation, grooming behaviors, and trusted offenders, rather than focusing only on strangers. Steven's kidnapping demonstrated that offenders often rely on deception rather than force. That lesson remains relevant decades later. In 1989, only months after Steven's death, a television miniseries titled "I Know My First Name is Steven" introduced his story to millions of viewers. While dramatized for television, it was based on the documented events surrounding his kidnapping and rescue. The production helped ensure that a new generation learned about Steven's courage and the importance of protecting missing children. Years later, the Stayner family would once again find itself at the center of national attention. In 1999, Steven's older brother, Cary Stayner, was arrested in connection with a series of murders committed near Yosemite National Park. The crimes shocked the nation. Because of the family's earlier history, many media reports revisited Steven's kidnapping. It is important to understand, however, that these were entirely separate cases. Steven had no connection to those crimes. His story should never be defined by the actions of another person. He is remembered for something very different: for protecting a frightened 5-year-old child, for finding the courage to walk into a police station after nearly 8 years of captivity, and for proving that extraordinary bravery can come from someone who had already endured more than most people could imagine. Today, Steven Stayner's name continues to appear in law enforcement training materials, child protection discussions, documentaries, books, and educational programs about missing children. His story reminds investigators why missing child cases should never be abandoned. For nearly 8 years, there was no breakthrough, no confirmed location, no successful rescue operation. Yet Steven was alive. Had investigators permanently closed the case, the truth might never have been fully understood. His case also reminds families of something equally important. Recovery is possible. Hope can survive even the longest investigations. Not every missing child case ends this way. But Steven's did. And because it did, another little boy was able to grow up with his own family. That is Steven Stayner's legacy. Not simply surviving, but making sure someone else survived too. We're about to reach the final chapter of Steven's story. Before we continue, what do you think is the greatest lesson from his courage? Share your thoughts respectfully before we close this documentary. Steven Stayner's story did not end the day he walked into the Ukiah Police Department. In many ways, that was only the beginning. His courage became part of American history. Law enforcement officers studying child abduction investigations still reference his case because it demonstrated something investigators had always hoped was possible. A missing child could survive. Even after years, Steven's rescue challenged assumptions that had existed for decades. Before 1980, many long-term missing child cases were viewed with diminishing hope as the years passed. Steven proved that hope should never disappear simply because time has. His decision to rescue Timothy White also transformed the way people remembered his case. Many kidnapping victims survive unimaginable circumstances. Few are placed in a position where they can save another child. Steven could have escaped alone. No one would have blamed him. After nearly 8 years of captivity, his first instinct could easily have been to protect himself. Instead, he looked at a frightened 5-year-old boy and recognized his own past. He understood exactly what Timmy faced, and he refused to leave him behind. That single decision ensured 2 families would be reunited instead of one. Years later, Timothy White often spoke publicly about Steven's bravery and the profound impact it had on his life. Their families remained connected by an extraordinary bond, one forged through courage, survival, and compassion. In recognition of Steven's heroism, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, created the Steven Stayner Award, presented to individuals who show exceptional courage in protecting children from exploitation and abduction. The award ensures that Steven's legacy extends far beyond his own story. His name continues to inspire those who dedicate their lives to safeguarding children. For investigators, Steven's case also reinforced the importance of never abandoning missing child investigations. Every lead matters. Every witness matters. Every photograph matters. Time can make an investigation more difficult, but it does not make it impossible. Today, advances in technology have dramatically improved the way missing child cases are investigated. Amber Alerts, national databases, digital surveillance, DNA analysis, public tip lines, interagency cooperation. Many of these tools were unavailable when Steven disappeared in 1972. His case became one of many that helped shape conversations about improving child protection and investigative coordination across the United States. But perhaps the most enduring lesson has nothing to do with technology. It is about people. A family's refusal to give up, investigators who continued searching, communities that remembered a missing child's face, and one young survivor who chose compassion over fear. Steven Stayner is often remembered as a hero. That description is deserved. But before he was a hero, he was a little boy. A 7-year-old who simply wanted to walk home from school. That is how every victim should first be remembered. Not by the crime committed against them, but by the life they deserve to live. At the Silence Evidence, every documentary exists for that reason. Not to sensationalize tragedy. Not to glorify offenders, but to preserve the memory of victims through verified facts, careful research, and respect for the families whose lives changed forever. Because behind every investigation, there is a person. Behind every missing child poster, there is a family waiting for a miracle. And sometimes, that miracle comes because one child finds the courage to save another. Steven Stayner's story reminds us that courage is not always loud. Sometimes, it is a frightened 14-year-old quietly walking into a police station with a little boy beside him. Sometimes, it is choosing to risk your own future so someone else can have theirs. And sometimes, one act of bravery echoes for generations. That is why Steven Stayner's name continues to be remembered. Not because he was taken, but because, when given the chance, he chose to bring someone else home. If this documentary helped you learn about Steven Stayner's extraordinary courage, consider subscribing to The Silence Evidence. Every share helps keep the stories of victims and survivors alive, ensuring they are remembered with the dignity and respect they deserve. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always follow the evidence.